today, and now the cracks are opening. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Well, that is post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And I have Tarric Brooker with me today again. Hi, Tarric.
G'day, Martin. How are you?
I'm a bit soggy, and I keep looking at these statistics coming out from the economic perspective and from the markets and thinking, oh, it's getting more and more rocky.
It is, and it's like the vibe of the market has changed quite significantly in the last, I don't know, maybe the last month or two, whereby, things aren't being ironed out and ignored as easily as they perhaps would have been not that long ago. I mean, when Delta emerged, the markets, had a few jitters, but they mostly ignored it. And, even just the announcement of this potential new variant stemming out of Africa, and all of a sudden people are quite concerned.
Yeah, well, more than 30 variants on the spike relative to the previous one is a significant variation. And of course, that means that some of the vaccines may be less effective. The question is, who will shut down what borders when?
Well, the UK has already closed their borders to 6 countries in Africa. That was done relatively quickly. Even members of the Morrison government, the health minister, Greg Hunt, came out today and said that, Australia is prepared to act if it becomes necessary. So, the question is that will it become necessary or not? And, that's probably the multi-trillion-dollar question at this point. And the truth is we have no idea.
No, and it is fascinating because, there are signs in some areas of some economic momentum, consumers in the US in particular, right? Although CPI was high too. But actually, generally, you have to say that the economic settings are looking, at least stormy or cloudy, right? And then you bring this over the top. But it is interesting watching the market reaction. I think this time the markets are going to get more twitchy more quickly.
That certainly seems to be the case. And I think part of that, this is just a theory. So, feel free to, come to your own conclusions. But I think part of the problem now is that in the past, in maybe sort of, March, April, May, June, when we started seeing these issues begin to emerge with other variants and issues with the vaccines not being as effective as they were previously when they first announced the results of the clinical trials and the approvals at the end of last year, this time inflation is a lot higher. In the past, it was a case of, oh, it's all right, we'll just throw another $4 or $5 trillion at the US economy or the global economy, and everything will be fine. But with producer prices going to the moon, in some cases at all-time record highs in some nations, we can't just throw more money at it. If we throw more money at it, we're just going to create more inflation. So we've really backed ourselves into a corner here. We really should have left some ammo for another round instead of using it all the first time.
Yes, and of course the real issue is that unfortunately quantitative easing or the equivalent, money printing or whatever you want to call it, is not a linear relationship, right? To be able to get the same effect, you need a logarithmic increase. So not only is it harder to do, but in an inflation-laden environment, it's almost impossible to do. And then you see, even Powell's acceptance speech, nothing about transitory, nothing about short term, all about inflation's now going to be on our agenda as one of the main items to focus on. So there's a change in the weather there too.
There is, and that's something that you and I have discussed quite extensively, and it's something that we said would happen. We discussed this back in, I think it was May and June when we first started doing the regular slideshows together, and that's something that we said, it was going to become a political hand grenade, and that's exactly what's happened. Everything in the US now politically is about inflation. Biden passed his infrastructure bill and it didn't even help his approval rating one iota. And he now has the worst approval rating at this stage of his presidency of any president post-World War II, with the exception of Donald Trump. And, that's for obvious reasons, given the division that was occurring in America at the time.
Yeah, and bringing in a deputy Fed, which is a Democrat, hasn't helped really either.
No, there is that sort of idea that Brainard, Laurel Brainard, who is, the new, sort of, I believe she's the vice chair of the Fed and, sort of the heir apparent if the Democrats get another term in the White House. And she's causing quite a few market jitters that they're just going to print and print to the moon. But even Brainard, someone who has espoused a certain amount of affinity for the MMT approach, for the, let's become more involved in the real economy approach, is increasingly inflation, inflation, inflation. And I think that the market really needs to be concerned by that, because I think if we are still seeing these major issues in, say, February, March next year, or perhaps even sooner, I think we could see rates being hiked a lot sooner than a lot of people expect. And one thing just on this particular issue is that the way it interacts with politics. In January and February, you're going to start to see fundraising efforts really take off for for the US primary season to decide candidates for House and Senate seats. And that's when that really starts to kick off, which is kind of crazy because the election is until November, but that's just the way America functions. But it just adds that extra political dimension to this, which could put pressure on the Fed to act a lot sooner than they otherwise would. In the same way that I imagine the current political pressure has forced them into tapering and being inflation, inflation, inflation a lot sooner than Powell or Brainard would have liked.
No, I think that's right. And the chances of a policy misstep now is probably heightened because of that political force. And, the worry I have both in the US and indeed in Australia is that some of these decisions seem to me to be taken out of the realms of, the economy and what makes sense economically speaking. It becomes a political football. And of course, here in Australia, we have elections next year. And in the US, as you say, there are more elections coming as well there. So it's interesting times. Now, of course, we always spend too much time introducing what we're going to talk about before we talk about it. So let's get straight into your slides, because I know that people are really here for your slides, Tarric.
Okay, I will fire that right up then. Okay. We've got a nice little thing of the tapering there, confronting Jay Powell.
I love it.
Alrighty, let's kick off. Now, this slide is quite good because it shows really that the issues being experienced by US supply chains and the issues being experienced with inflation in general in terms of the supply chain factor isn't just at the ports. There's this idea in US politics and in the US media, it's all right once we get the ports of LA, Long Beach, the ports in Georgia and unclogged, things are going to be fine. And as you can see, that's not the case. There's issues downstream. There's issues with trucking. There's issues with the availabilities of what they call chassis, which are basically just what you have the container mounted on when a truck takes it from the docks to a warehouse or elsewhere in the supply chain. And it's currently, the cost of trucking freight is currently rising at its fastest rate ever recorded in the 30 years of data that we have. So it's not just a maritime shipping issue. It's spreading all throughout the supply chain and isn't really showing any signs of letting up anytime soon.
No, and it's interesting. I did a show the other day when I went through the whole supply chain from ships to ports to trucks to warehousing, and at every stage, they have these interrelated problems. So it is, frankly, a huge global machine we're talking about here, and that global machine is misfiring in all sorts of places. And of course, the more that you get errors in one area or problems in one area, they just cascade and cascade and cascade. So there's no surprise that the costs are rising. And of course, those costs have to go somewhere, don't they?
Exactly. And it's also how long it takes for these things to be processed, for these for these backlogs to be righted, because people think of global supply chains, and it's easy to come to the conclusion that you buy something on Amazon, it gets picked up from a factory in Shanghai, it gets put on a plane, and then it's in your house within the next 24 hours. But the reality is that most products, the lead-in times are measured in months and months. You order, a company orders a product that it wants delivered in, say, March or April next year. It'll be doing those orders now or even prior to now. And then it will take time for the manufacturer to make those goods. And then then those goods need to be processed, sent to the docks there, and then so on and so forth. You're all aware of, how that logistics train works, but it's how long it takes for these things to be processed, particularly with these enormous port backlogs in China and in the US, that that are lengthening the time that these lead-in times are creating. I mean, the port backlog in China now isn't really going to impact American consumers on Christmas, or Australian consumers for that matter. Those issues are already baked in. What we're seeing now is going to create issues towards the middle of Q1 and into Q2 next year.
Absolutely. So I hope Santa booked his deliveries early, right? Because otherwise Santa's sleigh could be rather sparse this year.
Unfortunately, that is the case. I mean, I hope all the kids get the presents that they wanted. Now, okay, no, you see that fine. This basically just shows the enormity of the issue. Supplier delivery times for manufacturers in the US have blown out to record highs. It's just getting, frankly, a bit ridiculous. And it really rams home how silly the narrative is that is sort of propped up in elements of the media where they're just like, oh, things are getting better, things are going to be better soon. Now, I'm not even gonna try and figure out and make assumptions as to why they're saying that. But all I can say is that they're wrong, and things are going to take quite a lot longer to resolve, and it's not something that's just going to go away overnight. And that's something that this other chart on the right shows, just that, if you look at these port backlogs in the US, and then you look at the ones in China, which are even worse.
Yeah, and it is interesting, your comment about some of the media and how they're talking about this. They keep talking about it being a blippy and it'll go away quickly and it'll sort itself out, right? But once these breaks in flow have actually happened, it takes a long time to reverse out of it, because of course they're trying to sort of still stuff more things into the front end of the hopper, whilst still trying to deal with the backlog of stuff that's in the other end of the hopper. So I agree with you. This is going to go on for a long time. Well,
I mean, even the CEO of Maersk, who's one of the senior executives at Maersk, he's talking. He was talking the other day in an interview about this taking a long time to resolve, and it frankly requiring some level of demand destruction. And I think that may be what it ends up taking, especially if we do see more challenging economic times and we do see inflation beginning to impact consumer demand.
Yeah, and Gap in the US, when they came out with their latest results, called out specifically a fall in profitability simply because of the supply chains and, again, a signal that this was not going to get fixed quickly. So it really does have real-world consequences, not just at the esoteric level, but at the front line, as it were, and in the retail sector. And bear in mind this, Tarric, a huge proportion of the economic activity in the US is consumer driven. So if consumers can't get what they want, what are they going to do?
Yeah, well, and it's also if they feel comfortable paying that price for what they want.
Yep.
So I think that's something that we'll get to in the next few slides. Now, this is an interesting one because it's based on option markets within interest rate futures and bonds, and basically it shows that basically around 80% of the market believes that US inflation is going to remain above 3% for 5 years, and that's well above the Fed's target. I mean, that means essentially that you're effectively baking in something akin to rate hikes for the next 5 years. And I mean, I'm skeptical that inflation is going to last that long. I think it's much more likely that it'll destroy demand long before that happens. No, and personally, I don't think that we're going to see US inflation remain that strong for that long. But by the same token, that's what the market, well, at least this element of the market is increasingly seeing.
Yes, and inflation expectations was also high in Australia, right, in terms of at the consumer level. And it just begs the question, if the central banks are sitting there watching these indicators suggesting that inflation is going to be way above their target, they can no longer say it's transitory. They can no longer say we'll even it out over the medium term. I mean, that quantum of inflation, if it came true, well, it would be pretty dramatic, and it would be, frankly, a signal that once again central banks have lost the plot.
Pretty much. I mean, if you look at the Australian inflation expectations that you mentioned, the Roy Morgan Index the other day showed that Australians expected inflation of 4.9% over the next 2 years. And I mean, Australians generally tend to overestimate CPI inflation. I think they're actually pretty spot on in terms of how much inflation is actually occurring. But I mean, obviously, you've got the way that the CPI is weighted and everything else, which distorts things rather significantly. But it just goes to show that we I mean, even if you look at something like the federal budget, we are not going to see real wage growth until 2024, 2025. And if inflation is even stronger, the chances of us seeing real wage growth, goes down even further. And it's really not a pretty picture.
Right, and then add migration, right? Because the other point about wages growth is migration. The Reserve Bank finally got to the point of realizing that actually, if you have high migration, wages growth is much less likely to happen. And yet, of course, everyone's calling. In fact, I would say more than calling, making huge noises about it to increase migration. Another downward pressure on wages growth.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's the case. But I mean, it's the Australian way at this point. It boosts headline. I mean, I'll give you an example. Prior to COVID, Australian GDP growth over the 2019 calendar year was about 2.1%. The population grew by 1.5% over that same time. So we only had 0.6% growth after you account for population growth, which is frankly abysmal, given the level of deficit spent, given the level of government involvement in the economy. I mean, at that point, almost 90% of jobs growth for the data that I have in the 12 months between October 2018 and October 2019, more than 90% of jobs growth that occurred was in the public sector, despite the fact that we have a government that ostensibly says they want a small government.
Right, and also if you look at those statistics, a lot of it was actually in lower paid jobs like healthcare and allied areas, right? So the mix of jobs and the quality of jobs, because that's the other thing, of course, we should touch on here, has all gone pretty much the wrong way. So not only is it the quantum of job, but the quality of the job and the industry sector, all of those things are pointing backwards.
Well, that's really the challenge in all of this. I mean, when we went into this, the Morrison government was like, we're going to build a bridge, we're going to get back to the way things were in 2019. But 2019 wasn't that fantastic for a lot of people. And that really, it really does make you wonder where we're going to be when all of this is over, because, we got lucky with the virus, relatively speaking, in terms of the level of management. And then I'm referring to, 2020, early 2021. And then we got lucky again in terms of the ramp up in commodity prices. So we just keep getting protected by these little bubbles that pop up and, just protect the Aussie economy as they have periodically over the last 30 years. But it does make you wonder where we will be when our luck finally runs out.
Well, you could argue actually that maybe China has been helping, right? So forcing us to diversify our international trade routes, and they're detuning their property sector. Maybe those things are going to actually force some changes here in Australia. I'm not sure, but we don't seem capable of making good decisions off our own bat.
Well, I mean, I think the problem is it's the path of least resistance. That's really what we've done over the last 30 years. It's just been what's easier? What's the minimum effort for maximum possible return? I mean, we haven't really seen a whole lot of vision coming from the government in quite a long time. And I mean, don't get me wrong. We've had, if you go back to say the Labor years, we had things like the NDIS and stuff like that. But in terms of actual broader economic policy driving a greater agenda, that's something that we haven't had in decades.
No, I agree. In fact, I would argue that it's all about winning elections. It's not all about doing what's right for Australia. And often winning elections is more about short-term hip pocket support than anything else.
It is. And that, I mean, and to go back to this, this new variant of COVID, that could be another major factor in the coming months if it is as bad as some of the narratives suggest. We'll be right back on the stimulus train, and ScoMo will be the hero all over again. So, it's but by the same token, it's not really a good place to be. And I mean, it's all well and good to say, "Oh, look at what we achieved." It's like, well, you threw $500 billion at the economy. That is an absolute shed load of money. We know that we wasted at least $40 billion, and no one seems to care. But I think that it needs to be put into perspective that eventually this money is going to feed through the economy. Eventually, that activity is going to feed through, and it is going to fade. It's just the fact that we've never had any evidence, any data as to how long it would take for this amount of money to feed through. And I think that's what's really left a lot of people wrong-footed. And I include myself in this completely. It's just the fact that it was so much that it's just taken a lot longer to feed through than I would have otherwise thought based on previous Treasury documents.
Well, my analogy is the python and the elephant, right? Python being the economy, the elephant being the stimulus, right? They've swallowed it. It's working its way through. There's a big bulge, right? But the question is, what is the long-term damage to the python going to be?
Well, that's the thing. We don't know. And then there's also, the other side of things, which is the property sector here in Australia. The fact that we have, so many people have gone in and, bought homes under the idea that interest rates weren't going to rise for 3 years and all this other business. And it could end up being quite a bit more challenging. If we do have, future challenges with inflation, for example, and we see rising interest rates, it's just an unfortunate situation.
And the other point there, Tarric, is New Zealand, of course, lifted their rates this week, 0.75%. It looks as though rates will probably rise in the UK quite soon now, and other places too. So if Australia doesn't, if we keep our rates ultra low, despite the fact that the yield curve control thing basically got beaten to death by the markets, the only other thing that can change is the exchange rate. So the exchange rate will drop, and it could drop quite substantially. Now, it could be beneficial for some people, but it also is a big issue for others.
It is, and that's just the unbalanced nature of our economy. It's the reliance on the bulk commodity trade, and that's another factor that could potentially play a role in terms of the exchange rate. If we do see bulk commodity prices fall, if some of these decreases in activity in the Chinese property sector are baked in on the long term, right now in October we've seen 33% fewer housing starts than the October prior, and that's something, if realized, is going to smash iron ore demand globally, by over 10%. So you can't remove 10% of global iron ore demand and expect for prices to remain anywhere near this high. So, it really is a challenging picture if China doesn't end up kicking the can down the road. And that is a gigantic if.
No, I agree. And the other point there, of course, iron ore prices actually went a little higher earlier in the week. And I noticed how directly the stocks in the iron ore sector also moved up. But then the prices dropped a little bit. And guess what? The stocks have come back. So there's a huge sensitivity here to even small movements in the iron ore price and how it on-flows to a bunch of other dynamics in the markets too. This is a very unstable situation.
Unfortunately, yes. And it's also the fact that especially given the recent run-up in commodity prices, our miners are heavily represented in the ASX, which is something that could take a real beating if we do see commodity prices fall back to near their long-term averages. Particularly things like thermal coal and iron ore. So it's going to be interesting one way or another. Either the Chinese are going to eventually find some way to live with the idea that the property sector is going to be a ticking time bomb that's going to blow up in their face one day, or they're going to continue on in the game of chicken until it all just comes to a big crash, I suppose.
Well, sometimes people say to me, well, the only way to solve some of these economic issues is to allow the crash to happen. But of course, central banks have done everything up to this point to keep the crash from happening. And I think that's true as much in China as elsewhere.
Unfortunately so. Now, this regards something that we were discussing earlier. Basically, just the demand from US consumers for things like household durable goods. Basically, a durable good is something that's intended to last anything longer than, I believe, it's 3 years. So things like televisions, washing machines, fridges, etc. Major purchases. And the desire for people to buy them is literally dropped to an all-time record low in terms of the buying conditions. And it's a similar story for people looking to buy a house or to buy a car, and that's because prices have gone up enormously. I mean, there was a post on Twitter the other day of a car dealership selling a Toyota RAV4 hybrid, which is sort of a mid-range small 4x4, and it had a sticker price of $39,000. It had a dealer markup on it, which by the time all the other fees and charges were paid, raised the price to $89,000. So it sort of just indicates some of the price gouging and the opportunism that's occurring in the US at the moment with certain things.
Yeah, that's pretty scary. And of course, the thing about some of the consumer areas, people are still spending some of the stimulus money that they received. And I noticed that in my surveys, that we've got a proportion of the population who did quite well over the last 18 months because of all this money from government. But they're now getting to the end of that spending too. So that could be another reason why, in fact, with wages very flat, why demand could actually be coming off rather than actually anything else, right? So not only can't they get the stuff when they want to buy it, but also there's now less appetite because they've got less money coming in, and therefore savings ratios in the US are down, for example. They're back down pretty much to pre-COVID levels now. So there's a whole bunch of dynamics again in play.
There is, and I think that's something that's important to keep in mind just as part of the broader picture, in the sense that the wealthy have benefited so enormously from this, in, quite frankly, like never before, in terms of a financial, the growth in financial asset prices, and basically also the fact that in a lot of cases the government just threw money at them, with very few preconditions, particularly in the US. And the thing is, if they keep spending at elevated levels, it's entirely possible that we could see GDP growth, retail sales, all these other things look quite good, which really complicates things for the Fed and for other central banks. Because on one hand, if they've got high inflation, on the other hand, they've got a retail sector, and they've got an economy that looks on paper to be performing quite well. But the unfortunate reality is that 60% of that economy may be performing very poorly for those people who are suffering from their rents rising 11%, from their food prices rising 8%, from all these cost of living pressures. But as long as the rich people keep spending, it's gonna distort that, and ironically potentially lead to increased pressure on raising interest rates.
Well, you made exactly a critical point here, Tarric, and it comes back in my surveys. I see it, right? Because you can't take averages. You can't talk about average incomes, average households, average wealth, right? Because it's so distorted. And so you've got a proportion of the population who are doing really, really well and are still feeling very affluent and ready to spend. But there's a bigger proportion now of people really caught up. I did some work for another client quite recently on the refinancing issue. People are drawing money out of their mortgage just to pay for everyday expenses because that's all they've got. So again, you have to actually take a more rounded view rather than just saying, well, on average, things are improving. Average is masked completely.
Indeed. Now, this one is just, it's kind of astounding, really, that the ECB could still be saying we're not going to touch interest rates. That would be a mistake. German producer prices recently hit a 70-year high. They are the highest since 1951, which is when there was enormous price pressures as a result of the Korean War and the demand for goods, for steel, for you name it. And it just really rams home how much these price pressures are hitting are hitting manufacturers. Now, admittedly, part of this is the cost of gas in Europe, which has skyrocketed and is causing some fairly significant problems as a result. But by the same token, those price pressures are still there and are still at record highs, even if you take away those issues. They are still at multi-decade highs. And I think that it's just a little bit ridiculous that you've got journalists, you've got central bankers, you've got all these people telling the public and these businesses that these price pressures aren't a problem and that these businesses don't need to raise prices when it's quite clear that they do.
Right, and it gets back to the question, doesn't it? Because if the producer prices are up so much, then to an extent, some companies for a period might be able to swallow them, but they can't for very long. They have to ultimately find a way either of passing them along or stop altogether. So I agree with you. The ECB seems to be way off key in terms of reading the economy relative to or any of the data that you see. I don't quite understand why it is they're so far off the mark.
I think it's because if they raise rates, they're stuffed. I mean, German 10-year yields are still negative. I mean, which is insane in an economy that's experiencing. I mean, the idea that you're willing to lend your money to the German government for 10 years when manufacturers are seeing price pressures of nearly 20%, it just goes to show how insanely distorted the bond market is. I mean, I saw this chart the other day that showed that only about 10% of German bonds are actually in a free float. The rest of them are either owned by institutions who are required to own them, or they're owned by the European Central Bank. So it just distorts the ever-loving crap out of everything. And, it's really quite unfortunate.
Well, just look at the Japanese central bank and how much of the Japanese economy they own, because they've been at it the longest. And I think you can see the archetypal story outcome here, right? Because things are not going that well in Japan, despite the fact that they've tried really hard. The metrics are really going in the wrong direction. So the interesting question is, well, so how much of the economy can a central bank legitimately own? That is worth thinking about.
Well, it is. I mean, it does raise quite a few questions, and but even just to the broader issue, as you mentioned with Japan and Germany, I mean, it's all well and good for Wall Street to say, oh, look at how well the US economy is performing, but the rest of the world is going down the drain. I mean, there are some bright spots, don't get me wrong. India has bounced back fantastically from the Delta variant and the issues that it's had. But then you've got the rest of the world who's raising interest rates, who's battling inflation, who are still battling the virus, and relative economic stagnation. And this is with enormous levels of fiscal and monetary support. So, it kind of boggles my mind when you take a broad perspective and then you look at the world and you go, that's fantastic. When in actual fact, what people should be saying is, wow, all that money and this is the best we could do.
And I'll make one other point, and that is that a strong US dollar, right, might help the US economy, but actually a strong US dollar has exactly the reverse effect everywhere else. So in a way, I think you could argue that Powell is just thinking about the local economy in the US more than anything else, which is at one level understandable. But surely the point is that you can't just think of one part of this global edifice that's been built. You've actually got to take a broader view. But stronger the dollar, the weaker other economies will be around the world.
Well, the interesting thing with the dollar is that there is speculation that Janet Yellen, who is the Treasury Secretary, wants a stronger dollar. And a stronger dollar is going to help minimize, well, not minimize is probably the wrong word. It's going to somewhat blunt the impact of rising inflation on American consumers. Now, I don't know how true that is. It's obviously only speculation, but I have heard it from some rather intelligent people. And it does, I mean, they don't think it's going to work very well, but I mean, at the end of the day, neither is releasing 15 hours worth of oil reserves onto the global market, but that's where we're at the moment. We're a little bit like Tom Hanks in Saving Private Ryan, pulling out his sidearm to shoot at a tank.
Yeah, I actually like the box of chocolates, Tom Hanks, right? Life's a box of chocolates, right? Well, we seem to have a few nutty ones at the moment.
Oh, God. Now, this is a good one that basically just shows the issues within within the Chinese economy and the property sector. Basically, if you look across the major cities of China, with large populations, you're looking at vacancy rates, according to some analyses, of about 20%, which is frankly just nuts. I mean, even if you take the absolute highest estimates from the census of the number of empty houses in Australia, it's still less than half the number of empty homes in China. And that's the absolute highest estimate. If you go by one, say by like Prosper Australia, China has 5 times as many empty homes as Australia per capita. So it just goes to show that if the bubble does burst, if all these investment homes that all these Chinese property investors own are sold onto the market, there's nowhere near enough demand to be able to absorb them all at anywhere near the current prices. I mean, don't get me wrong, it'd be great for the Chinese classes who don't own a property, because eventually some form of equilibrium will be reached. But by then, the people who bought these properties at up to 43 times household incomes for these cities would be absolutely ruined. So, it is something to watch if they do press on with this controlled demolition of the dodgier elements of the Chinese property sector.
It does come back to this question of China trying to sort of adjust slightly the very significant diversity between the very rich and everybody else. But in doing so, if what you're doing is writing down the value of properties for those people who own properties, that's going to have a huge impact. And I wonder what the societal impacts will be. And, in a communist context, is that actually even feasible?
Well, in a communist context, it's fantastic, really. I mean, okay, you're going to have the property owning class getting smashed, the people who've bought on at a solely speculative level. But for everybody else who doesn't own a property, for people who want to move into the city, who want to enjoy that type of different life, the opportunities that living in a place like Guangzhou or Shanghai can present them, rather than where they live in where a lot of people still live in rural China. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing in the long run, and I think that I wouldn't be surprised if President Xi sees things similarly, because it's not really common prosperity when a house costs very nearly as much as people earn in a lifetime, and 85% of new homes, according to some analyses, are bought by speculators. So, I don't think it's necessarily, it'd be a painful adjustment for a large segment of society, but I don't think it's anywhere near as a challenging a one in China as it would be here in the West if we experienced a similar fall from such a great height.
And of course, Xi really does have now the momentum to do it, based on what's happened recently with the confirmation of his status, etc., etc. So he's not going anywhere, and that means that basically he can drive some of this for the benefit of the greater good in China.
Well, I think Xi sees the writing on the wall. The Chinese Communist Party's rule is going to get more challenging as demographics degrade, as more people as the percentage of the population that are older gets larger, as the number of working age people shrinks, and it already has begun shrinking. In some cases, some people believe it started shrinking as early as 2016, 2017. So, the period of easy growth for China is coming to an end, and things get more challenging from here. So I think that, if they could suddenly flip a switch and say we want 3% growth or 2% growth, and it's going to be sustainable, that would be much more preferable than pushing for 5 or 6% growth with all these risks. But obviously there's quite a big leap between those two outcomes, and I'm not sure exactly whether or not they're going to be able to pull it off, or whether or not eventually the Chinese government is going to be forced to panic. I think inflation is going to be a major issue for them. And I think that's probably what's even holding back some of them from doing more stimulus now. Because, there's obviously the Xi factor, but they can't just throw a heap of money at the property sector again, because it'll just pump commodity prices and inflation even more.
Yeah, well, like many other central banks around the world, they are in a dark place, and there aren't many exit signs, really, are they?
No, This chart doesn't really need much introduction, really. I mean, $900 worth of flows into US stock ETFs that are, on the long side, sort of making the investment that the stocks will go up more than the prior 19 years combined. Now, I mean, really, what more is there to say?
Well, my reaction to that is, yeah, and there's a similar chart with the debt and the rise in debt. So how much of the debt that's actually been issued, right, has ultimately flowed through the process and has just gone into those investments? I think quite a lot of it.
Unfortunately so. And I mean, I think in a lot of ways, this also shows the fact that, that this period is, what's the word? It's highly distorted by what has resulted from the pandemic with the stimulus and everything else. And it does make you wonder how much longer this can keep going on once you do remove these temporary factors that are supporting the market.
You mean the permanent temporary factors, right? So they've started in GFC land and has continued only more so. We are not in a free market, right? We're not in a market where the normal market rules apply, because everybody's just got highly manipulated markets, and that's the problem. We don't know what the true situation is because we've got all these manipulations, right? Where we're trying to stop everything from failing, so we'll throw more liquidity at it. A lot of that money then flows around the system and goes then to inflate asset prices, and those asset prices might give some people some comfort, but it creates other problems too. There is a horrible sense in my mind of we've lost the control that we had, if we had any, on the economies around the world. And in fact, the more this continues, the greater the risks will be that ultimately things fall away and fall apart. Going back to what I said earlier on, this logarithmic problem, you've got to keep doing more and more and more just to get the same result. And how much have we thrown at it already?
Yeah. I think part of the issue in all of this is just the level of distortion going on as a result of all the things you mentioned. I mean, yes, you've got QE, but then you've also got fiscal policy. You've also got the fact that yes, corporate earnings are being supported by all this extra money. People have gone out and they've gone, I'll go buy a new iPhone, or I'll buy something on Amazon or whatever, and then but that's also highly distortionary. Eventually, things will return to trend. Eventually, excess savings will be spent. Eventually, the stimulus will feed through. And it's really quite concerning seeing people basing all these long-term forecasts for asset prices and stocks in particular on these cash flows that have been artificially distorted. I mean, it just seems kind of nuts, but it's just being done anyway. I mean, I know that we don't know when this is going to end. We could see, the wealthy continuing to pump more money through these companies for another couple of years. But by the same token, it might come to an abrupt stop once their confidence is undermined by any number of different things, whether it's, rising interest rates spooking the market or another COVID variant. We just don't know.
No, I will make one point. I don't know whether you saw it, but the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, in their most recent documentation relating to the lifting interest rates, they had this house price chart which basically showed a huge peak, but then their forward projections is for a 30% fall relative to what we've seen previously. So, at some point, this is going to come to an end, and when it does, boy, it's going to be painful.
It is, and I think that the part of the problem is that we are geared as humans to the present. We are geared to the present and the relatively immediate future. 3 months, maybe 6 months. But the problem is that you say look at the housing market in Australia, for example. We don't fully understand what exactly has occurred to drive all of this. What factors have provided what degree of support? Yes, obviously, lower interest rates have been an absolutely huge factor. But what about the fact that we ended up with near record low levels of stock for the last few decades on the market? How much did that help pump up prices? How much did the relatively low amount of stock in places like the New South Wales South and North Coast, places like the Sunshine Coast, places like that, how much did that play a role in inflating prices? How much did the increase in household formation, because people just couldn't stand to be around their roommates or their parents anymore, result in increased demand and increased rental demand and all these other factors? The truth is we don't know exactly what has done what in this instance, and we don't know how long-lived that demand is going to be at those prices. And maybe the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is right. Maybe that demand will fall away as rates rise and things could get painful. I mean, the truth is we lack the data to be able to say definitively. And I think that's something that people should keep in mind as they make their decisions, of just really try and do your homework to the best of your ability and talk to, and explore the most possible, scenarios for what may play out.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I'd make the point that one of the prime drivers for high migration, a high-rise Harrier was on this the other day, is to try and support the property market and allow them to build more stuff, right? Again, that's not a natural market. It's a manipulated market. And we know that low interest rates and high credit availability has also been driving it. But we don't know actually how this is going to play out. And I agree with you. Now more than ever, people need to be careful about some of the decisions they take. And frankly, they can't and they should not just take the the high-level statement from the mainstream media on what's going to happen, because they're not actually able to communicate the granularity and detail that's required to help make better decisions.
Well, it's also the fact that to be completely frank, that everyone is different as well. I mean, it's all well and good to have these 4-page spreads in the newspaper talking about how fantastic it is to own a property. But there are people in certain markets who have seen basically zero growth over the last 12 to 15 years. There are other people who've bought in some other markets who've seen the price of their house double in the last 18 months. So it's really, as you say, an incredibly granular thing, which requires people to do their research at a grassroots level, rather than just going, oh, I'm buying a property in Brisbane or I'm buying a property in Melbourne and ergo it's going to go up. There are all these other factors. And particularly now, in the aftermath of lockdown, with the potential of more lockdown, and God, I hope I'm wrong, that there won't be one, but I mean, it's unfortunately a possibility, as we're seeing overseas. There are all these different things that could potentially affect the outcome of these property markets, particularly in, say, places like Melbourne, where there is that drive for people to leave.
No, I agree. And well, I run my one-to-one service where I go very granular and look at a particular area and look at all the dynamics around it and show the multiple parameters that are driving it, right? And I can tell you, having done many, many of those studies, every suburb is different. Lots of different drivers, lots of different behaviours, different supply-demand dynamics. So trying to aggregate that up and just pick a high-level number shows to me that it's just a really stupid thing to try and do. You have to go granular. You have to really get local. And when you do that, you then start to see these massive contrasts. I keep talking North Ryde units. They're still down lower than they were back in 2017 by about 26% on average, right? For all sorts of reasons, whereas other places, it's a very different story. So people need to go into a degree of, analysis now. Now, a few years ago, if there was an expectation that everything is going to go up, which, by the way, never really happened, maybe you didn't need to do it, but you have to do it now, because if you don't do it, the chances are you're going to end up with a lemon.
Well, I just wish people luck on that one, because even looking at properties myself, it is a very, very challenging thing, and there are a lot of different factors that need to be explored. Now, this is an interesting one. It basically shows that the input costs for manufacturers around the world they're rocketing. In some cases, multi-decade highs. And Australia so far have lagged somewhat. They are, don't get me wrong, they're still at well above the heights that they have been in the past. And, they're still at, multi-decade highs as well, but they're not as strong as they have been in other countries. Now, there are a lot of theories on this as to why. the relative strength of the dollar, for example, compared with things like the euro or the yen. Obviously that has helped somewhat, but it could also be the fact that we have spent quite a lot of time in lockdown, and there just hasn't been that level of demand for goods, for raw materials. So this is going to be an interesting one to watch going forward, because Australian inflation expectations are getting quite a lot higher, and it's obviously inflation is the number one issue at the moment, both in the media and for the Reserve Bank.
Yeah, I wonder how much of it is also affected by the fact that we don't make a lot of stuff here. Most of our stuff comes in by way of imports, so maybe the manufacturing impacts here would be less than other countries.
It could be. It's a difficult one to quantify, and I think that the inflation issue is definitely something worth just keeping an eye on, because I mean, it's like there was an article in the AFR the other day, that said basically if the ABS measured inflation in the same way that Statistics New Zealand does, we would already have significantly higher interest rates. So, it is really a complex web that is really in a lot of ways poorly understood, because it really is a bit of a black box.
Well, I have to agree with you on that, and I keep showing that if you actually were to calculate inflation on the way that it was done before the RBA took housing costs out and downplayed that as an element, right? They would have never taken rates as low, because they would have actually blown all of their metrics. So in a way, we've got this self-reinforcing loop whereby the Reserve Bank has taken rates ultra low because they've actually measured inflation in a way that they advocated for, but actually which isn't necessarily very appropriate. And in so doing, they've created this loop that we've got. How we get out of it is tricky times.
Well, I mean, I don't know if we can. Obviously it's possible. Obviously we will at some point, but how many challenges have to be overcome in order for us to do that is another matter entirely. And I believe, yes, that's the last slide for today.
Well, that's terrific, and thank you very much for putting those together. And the good news is we got through them without a massive rush at the end.
Yes, thankfully, not like last week.
No, we try to keep these chats to about an hour or just a bit under. And it's interesting, Tarric, because I've had some people say we really love these shows because you get into so much detail and you really paint a picture of how things interact with each other. And then other people say, oh, it's too long. You should just put the slides up, right? Now, the good news is you do actually generally share the slides on your Twitter feed, and we've put the Twitter link up. So if people just want to look at the slides and not listen to the discussion around it, you can actually go there. But I actually think the richness of these conversations is actually based on not just the data, but how we actually take the data and actually interpret it, because it's all in interpretation, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'd like to think that we're doing a good job. So, but yeah, no, I think it's about taking something that is quite abstract in some cases and then just putting it into its correct context, because it's all and good to have a PMI or to have a vacancy rate or to have whatever it is, but without the correct context, without having how all these different things interact with each other, it's not really there's not really a whole lot of point to it in some cases. And I think that's, in some ways, ironically, I think that's where a lot of Wall Street analysts fall down, because they don't really fully grasp exactly how much things end up interacting with each other. Don't get me wrong, some of them are very, very good at what they do. But once you factor in how all these other things interact with each other, all of a sudden it becomes a much, much more complicated picture, and in a lot of ways, much, much more challenging to predict.
Yeah, and there's worth thinking about what's the so-called butterfly effect, right? Which is a butterfly flaps its wings over there in another country, and it creates a whole series of events and consequences which could cascade and impact the weather in some other place, right? Now, may seem a really weird example, but the point is all of these various things are interacting, and it's a very complex dynamic model. And in fact, many economists can only model, or even analysts can only model by holding everything else constant and looking at the interaction of just one or two things, right? But and I know that in the real world, you can't do that because everything is connected.
Yeah, and everything is constantly evolving, and that really is the challenge in all of this, and in the prediction game. Because, say for example, just as we were discussing before, with the issue of how long it takes for stimulus to feed through the economy. I mean, I don't know about you, but for myself, I looked at the previous Treasury research. I looked at all the previous data that was there from the IMF and the World Bank, and I'm like, okay, this is what's going to happen. And then it's like, well, no, that's not what happened, because they never thrown this much money at the economy before. So, there are all these other variables that are constantly evolving.
I agree. Well, that's one of the reasons why I don't make predictions now. People will say, "Oh, you've made this prediction." No, I haven't. No, I haven't. I've shown different scenarios, right? I think the only way to really illustrate what's going on is to show how different futures could develop in circumstances, right? And try and give some sort of relativity in terms of how it might play out. That's why I do what I do, because I actually don't think it is possible to make a prediction and hold to it, because there are always input variables that are changing. They're always interacting with each other, and you've got other externalities, be it China or the US or whatever. So I think it's much more sensible to talk about different scenarios. Now, I know people want a simple answer, but sometimes actually a simple wrong answer is a lot worse than a more complex "it depends" answer.
That's true. That's very true. I mean, personally, I like playing predict it. I like looking at a situation in a given time and based on that snapshot, throwing it, making my prediction. I mean, I'd say probably most of the time I'm right. Some of the times I'm wrong, but unlike a lot of people who make predictions, I will own it when I'm wrong. Like I just said, when it came to the level of how long it would take for stimulus to feed through, I put my hand up. I got it wrong. I put together the data, I made a prediction, and I was wrong. But by the same token, I also said, oh, hey, we need to be cautious about Europe going back into lockdown. And, I mean, we talked about that in the European summer when everyone was, I imagine everyone was like, "Oh, you're a doomsayer. Stop with your doom mongering and all this other business." And here we are, 6 months later, and we're correct. And we talked about the issues with the vaccine potentially not being as effective as its initial promise, and that's happening as well. And I think that it's just about caution. It's just about approaching things with an open mind and a sense that, well, maybe the mainstream narrative isn't right. Maybe things aren't as hopeful as we hope they will be. And there's nothing wrong with being hopeful, but it needs to be realistic. And I think that's part of the problem of what some central bankers and governments have fallen into over these last 18 months. It's so easy to just go, oh, it's done. Everything's fine. We're going to be great from here. And it's happened so many times, and so many times they've got it wrong.
Well, I think, Tarric, the problem is that you then get accused of talking the economy down, right? And I've always found that a really, really difficult accusation to handle, because, no, I'm not talking the economy down. I'm just trying to call it out as best I can the way I see it, warts and all. I'll show the good things and I'll show the less good things, right? But I wish a few politicians and central bankers and regulators would do the same, because they are also, in their own way, spinning a story to support a particular political narrative without necessarily taking into account all of the data that actually is available.
Well, I mean, the Fed and the RBA, I think, is a good example in this instance. You had the Fed saying transitory, 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 without defining what transitory was. And now that inflation's become a political hand grenade, all of a sudden they're like, oh crap, we need to do something about this, and we need to do something about this soon. Yet the RBA continues to harp on about no rate hikes for 3 years, and that it's highly unlikely that they're going to move any sooner than that. And I wouldn't call it highly unlikely. I'd say it was data dependent. I would say that rate hikes sooner are a reasonably strong possibility, but I wouldn't, I'd be relatively non-committal. But they continue to harp on about no, it's going to happen, no rate hikes, no rate hikes. But what if the Fed hikes in, say April, May next year? Say they hike in April, inflation's really, really strong here in Australia, things have picked up. We've started to see some wage growth as a result of no immigration, and because of the lag in our data, we're not going to know for yonks until after all the migrants have arrived how much it's affected us. And the RBA is forced to raise rates, and then all of a sudden, one, it's going to blow up in Scott Morrison's face at the next election, if we do have an election in May, And two, all these people are going to be incredibly pissed off with the RBA, and their credibility is going to go out the window. I mean, and to be frank, in a lot of ways, it's already gone out the window with the market anyway.
I was going to say the RBA's credibility went out the window some time ago. But it's interesting, of course, that Phil Lowe has sort of pretty much said, well, we should probably look at yield curve control and term funding facility, right? I think that's a wonderful misdirection, because what you really need is a fundamental inquiry into the efficacy of the Reserve Bank and its policies for the last 20 years. That's what we really need to be looking at. But I'm not sure that my prediction is we probably won't get there on that for some long time.
Well, you made a prediction. I mean, thought we we're supposed to be doing that, but no. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's not gonna happen. I mean, maybe it will. Maybe in a couple of years' time we'll have a different government and there'll be a different independence. I mean, maybe your mate Steve Keen will be pushing the button in the Senate constantly, just trying to get them to change their tack. But I mean, we just unfortunately we don't know, and unfortunately, I fear the status quo will reign for quite some time in that regard.
I think you're probably right. Well, I'm going to make two other predictions. The first one is we're about to end the show, so that's definitely one that's right. The second one is I predict we'll be back again in a couple of weeks to explore it again, Tarric, and I'm pretty confident that prediction will come true.
Yeah, I'm fairly certain you're right, and I have a feeling that there's going to be even more to talk about.
I wouldn't be surprised at all. Thanks for your time, as always. Thanks for all the slides. Great work, and we'll catch you up again next couple of weeks.
No worries, mate. I'll see you then.
See ya. Take care.
Bye.